So this video is all about water, but I want to start by talking about fire. You're probably aware that Australia is literally on fire at the moment. You know, the Amazon rainforest fire that everyone was talking about a few years ago, and the Californian fire before that. Put both of those fires together and then times that by 3. That's how big the fires are in Australia. Millions of acres of land have been burned, thousands have lost their homes, and over 500 million animals have been killed. Professional and volunteer fighters are stretched well beyond breaking point, and relief services are struggling to keep up. If you can spare any money at all, even a few bucks, then consider donating to one of the organizations I've listed in the description below and the top comment. Any and all support would go a long way, as the path back from this level of devastation is a long one. Thanks everyone for hearing me out, and let's get on with the video. This video contains visual spoilers for Subnautica. If you don't want the sights of this game spoiled for you, consider listening to this video as you would a podcast, in which case it will be almost entirely spoiler free. So in this episode of Late to the Party with Skill Up, I'm going to declare that Subnautica is a very good video game. Let me show you. Let's start by talking about how I arrived at Subnautica, since it's probably a less than conventional path. When it first came out of early access, I remember my comment section spamming me with, "Oh my god, you must play this game," but I kind of ignored all of that because I saw that this was a survival game, and I don't like survival games. Believe me, I've tried Rust, Ark, DayZ, State of Decay, Don't Starve, Age of Conan, No Man's Sky at launch, and No Man's Sky Next, and even Minecraft. Yes, I do not particularly like Minecraft. Please don't tell PewDiePie I'm scared of the 9-year-old army. I've had two major issues with this genre. Number one, there's just so much bullshit baked into it. I really bristle against what I call eat your vegetables game design. Game mechanics that force you to do tons and tons of boring bullshit to eventually arrive at a payoff. Grinding Pokemon, leveling up in classic JRPGs, collecting resources in open world games. The survival genre seems to want to take all of these ideas and combine them into one big creamy vegetable smoothie of pain without any of the payoff to make it worth it. And yeah, that's the number 2 thing on my list of why I've never really enjoyed the survival genre. For me, the payoff just never felt worth it. These games rarely have compelling stories, they rarely have fleshed out endgames, they typically struggle to meter out feelings of satisfaction at, you know, decent intervals. You just feel like you're on the hamster wheel the entire time, and when you do make some big breakthrough like acquiring a capital ship in No Man's Sky, you're still gonna have to go back to doing the same boring bullshit you were doing just before this incredible breakthrough. Survival games typically struggle to deliver a smooth feeling of progression, something that Subnautica itself struggles with greatly, but it makes up for it in a lot of other ways. Anyway, that's why I don't like survival games. So why did I pick up Subnautica again? Oh yeah. Outer Wilds may not have won Game of the Year from the Game Awards, but a fairly sizable chunk of publications have had sense enough to give it the honor it so rightly deserves. It was my Game of the Year by a country mile, and as I was editing my Game of the Year video and I came to that section, I heard that song, you know, that like... Damn, I need to find something like this. I need to feel this again. Outer Wilds is celebrated for a multitude of reasons, like its stunning world design, its physics-based systems, and its clever puzzles, but what stood out for me most was 2 things: the way the game clearly communicates objectives to you without any hand-holding, and the sense of awe associated with each new advancement you make. I'd always known that Subnautica was celebrated for these 2 things in particular, and with nostalgic melancholy in my heart aching to feel those Outer Wilds feels once more, I booted up Subnautica, and in I dove. Okay, so let's start with easily the worst part about Subnautica, like the worst of the worst, the optimization. The footage you will see throughout this video will look atrocious because I had to go from 1440p down to 1080p and then I had to drop everything down to minimum settings, and even then I had to go in and like turn off extra stuff. With all of these changes, I still played this game at an average of 20 FPS, regularly dropping down to 10 FPS depending on which biome I was in. You might say, well, obviously your computer sucks, get a bit. I have an RTX 2080 Ti and an AMD Ryzen 3900. By the way, thank you AMD for that. In a weird twist, Subnautica is widely reported to run worse on very high-end machines like mine. Mid-range PCs report that the game runs fairly well for them, but you can still expect massive frame drops from time to time. Console appears to be roughly the same. So look, does this suck? Yes, it definitely sucks. If this were almost any other game, I'd care a lot more about this stuff because it's actually the worst game I have ever played in terms of optimization. But the underlying game is so good that I pushed through all of this because it was just so worth it. You know, I'm getting really tired of games that tell me what to do. I just find them less interesting these days than I did only a short while ago, and I don't think I'm alone in that. I think one of the secrets to Dark Souls' success was that it never gave you map markers or clear objectives. The walking simulators we've seen rise in popularity this generation seem to follow this trend. Breath of the Wild is perhaps the most mainstream example of this design philosophy, though its implementation is far more conservative than something like Outer Wilds, which embraces this approach wholesale. From the moment I stepped into Subnautica, I could tell that this was going to be something I would enjoy because it didn't tell me what I should be doing. I mean, I had a small tech tree available, but I didn't have some quest log on the side saying build a knife. It's like, dude, you're fucking stranded in the middle of nowhere, you need to hunt for food, you have a machine that clearly says I can build a knife for you. Do you really need a quest objective telling you to build the knife? No, of course you don't. But almost every other survival game does this. In fact, almost every video game does this. Subnautica's like, look, if you're too dumb to realize that you need a knife to survive at this point, then you are not gonna make it, buddy. It's this free-form, freewheeling approach to objectives that defines much of the early game in Subnautica. You're so early in the piece that you're probably expecting it to be basically like every other survival game. Just exist in the world, don't die, get bored of game, stop playing. The fantastic story, lore, and the sense of mystery unfolding is still completely hidden from the player, and as a result, we're really guided by the tech tree building requirements and our natural sense of curiosity. Luckily, this is more than enough to keep us playing. It's inevitable that within our first few moments of exploring the shallows, you're going to find something remarkable. Be it wavy vegetation, that lags my machine, bulb-tailed sea otters that emit some sort of toxic vapor, twisting and turning caves that you can't help but get lost in, the very skybox itself as night falls, and you see distant planets and moons cruise silently across the skyline. What makes all of this particularly intoxicating is the ease of its accessibility. Survival games are typically set on land and rely on clunky, stilted movement mechanics. Travel times from point A to B are long, and wildlife you'll meet is typically both hostile and far stronger than you are. Subnautica inverts all of this. Immediately, every direction is open to you. You can glide there effortlessly, and none of the wildlife poses a threat so significant that it would deter you. You feel like Aquaman arriving at a new span of ocean. Like, this is your kingdom, now you just need to figure out how you're going to rule it. When we talk about games like Subnautica or Outer Wilds like having no objectives, this is of course really lazy phraseology. There are objectives, very clear ones in fact. What we're actually saying is that the game relies on experiential learning, discovery, and curiosity to arrive at those objectives, rather than having them spoon-fed to us through UI, quest logs, or NPC exposition. Subnautica excels at this. The tech tree is our foundation, and it's the most gamey aspect of the game. It shows what we can make, and since all of these items have usefulness to us, we're incentivized to make them. What's unclear though is what's required to make some of the base ingredients, stuff like glass or fiber mesh, etc. The tech tree hides this information from us at first, and only reveals it to us after we've collected the base materials out in the wild. So we'll learn how to make fiber mesh the first time we collect Creepvine.
New blueprint acquired.
Many other survival games have tech trees and menus that explicitly spell out what you need and where to get it from. From the very start, Subnautica is teaching the player that exploration and experimentation is a vital ingredient of the gameplay formula. This philosophy is carried forward in the expansion of the tech tree schematics. The majority of things you can build aren't known to the player until you discover a data pad at a sunken wreckage. This naturally pushes the player out onto the seafloor, searching every which direction for new wreckages containing new technological advancement. Where things get really clever is the way that Subnautica uses stuff like landmarks and radio signals to nudge the player forward. The Aurora is, of course, the biggest landmark, and after you work up the courage to venture toward it, you'll quickly be informed that radiation in the area stops you from reaching it. Okay, you think, clearly I'm going to need some sort of tech that shields me from radiation. The game doesn't explicitly tell you, hey man, you should build a radiation suit, but if you're clever enough to make it to that point, you'll probably figure this out for yourself. You now have a goal in the back of your mind that you'll carry with you for at least a few hours while you busy yourself with other tasks. It won't be long until you get your first radio signals. Ghost echoes from the Aurora, the Degassi or alien species native to the planet. The radio gives the player story beats and points of interest to explore. In the early stages, the player is given signals pointing directly to these points of interest, but later in the game, these signals often involve clues and directions, forcing the player to search for these places rather than just following a marker. I really like this design a lot. It's exactly what I'm looking for at this point in my game playing life. This generation was the generation of the open world game, and I'd argue that the central guiding principle at play in most of these games was player centricity. Building systems, tools, UI prompts, guides, explanations, GPS systems, tutorials, every single possible thing that could be implemented to make the player feel comfortable and confident in these worlds. It was a case of building these untamed, expansive spaces, only to immediately give the player every tool they need to tame them, and to make the spaces feel smaller and less mysterious. Hell, Subnautica doesn't even have a map. One of the most satisfying things you can do in Subnautica is build a network of beacons scattered throughout the ocean that map out the different biomes you've discovered. This is a pretty big game, and unless you're really paying attention, it's pretty easy to forget where things are. Not having a map is one of the ballsiest and best decisions that the developer, Unknown Worlds, makes, because it puts the player in a permanent state of disorientation unless they spend the time to map it out themselves. If players do choose to do this, then they're going to be far more familiar with the entirety of the space than if they were reliant on GPS-style waypoints and fast travel alone. Mastery in Subnautica is not limited to simply knowing the map. One of the most rewarding experiences that players can have is figuring out the rules of the world and then using those rules to their advantage. The discovery that brain coral belches out oxygen bubbles allows you to stay in the deeps for longer. Understanding the day-night cycle becomes critical to effectively managing power consumption at your base. Knowing that sand sharks will lie in wait for you, ready to ambush you when you draw close, will make you alert when you hear their distant calls. Knowing where the sea treader leviathans graze will make resource collection a breeze. In none of these examples did the game tell you that these mechanics exist, not by UI prompt or your AI explaining it or some NPC radioing in. You just had to figure this stuff out as you went, and each new organic discovery made you more powerful than you were before without relying on level ups or stat gains or stat tree unlocks or new equipment. Knowledge is power in the real world, but this is very rarely true in video games. It's very true here in Subnautica. But just at the point where you've built a small base, upgraded your equipment, learned how the world works, just at the point where you're starting to feel comfortable, safe, and in control, it's time to go down. Way down. I just want to pause and say how much I love the way Subnautica handles progression. Where other open world games rely on things like level gating, walls, or areas that are simply hidden by story beats, Subnautica's stratified ocean is a means of gating progression that feels so natural. Of course you can't go deeper because you can't hold your breath that long. Of course you can't go deeper because your sea glide can only carry you so far before you run out of both breath and battery. Of course you can't go deeper because your sea moth will be crushed by the pressure. Each new technological milestone you reach is one that allows you to go deeper and stay there longer. That's a gating process that feels so satisfying to break through because it's like breaking the laws of nature. There's no contrivance here, no suspension of disbelief, no convoluted gamified bullshit we need to sit through. It's the ocean, man. Like, it's deep, it's dark, And if you want to get to the bottom of it, then you had better earn it. Oh yeah, and by the way, it's also fucking scary. You know what's weird about Subnautica? We're really not in much danger at any point. As far as survival games go, there's no PvP, so you aren't going to get ganked, and the various sea creatures you encounter really don't pose much of a threat. They're very easily avoided in almost every situation. But like, damn, if this isn't like maybe the most terrifying game I think I've ever played in my life. Anytime I left the shallows, anytime I did anything at all that took me away from my main base, I was terrified almost the entire time. I cannot tell you how much courage it took me to put the nose of that seamouth down and hit the accelerator. If there was some way for me to play through all of Subnautica without ever having to go deeper than 20 meters, I would play through the whole game like that. No question, no doubt. In fact, I know that something really bad happens when you go off the far edge of the map. Like there is an edge to the map and it goes, I know something bad happens, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna go find out what that is, right? And then I'm getting towards there and I'm getting really close, and then my AI says something like, oh, whatever you're doing, are you sure it's worth it? And I'm like, nope, that's it, I'm out. And fucking turn around, just went back. I still to this day do not know what happens when you go off the edge of the map because I'm too fucking scared to find out. That is true. I do not know. I do not want to know. You know, I felt something similar to this feeling of terror while playing the Outer Wilds, but it was different there because in that game, everything can kill you all the time, and it will. You're such a tiny, insignificant speck of space dust, and every single gear in this giant clockwork universe will crunch you into even smaller specks of dust all the time. Every new thing I encountered in that game, I was like, wonder how this thing's gonna kill me. But it's not like that in Subnautica. You're generally pretty safe all the time, so why am I so scared? I think firstly we need to recognize that as humans, we're sort of biologically programmed to be at least a little bit afraid of lots of water. Thalassophobia, probably not how you pronounce it, but whatever, is the scientific term for people that experience this acutely, but we'd all be pretty freaked out if we got dropped into a big see-through bubble and we got sent 1 kilometer down to the bottom of the sea. We aren't meant to be there, just like we aren't meant to be in the sky, so our minds naturally gravitate towards all the things that could go wrong, and the terror begins to creep in. In the case of Subnautica, I think the fear comes not from our vulnerability, but from the sense that we simply don't belong in these places. The thin glass that separates us from certain doom is enough to keep us safe from danger, but not from the niggling feeling that we just shouldn't be there and we should do everything we can to get the fuck out of there ASAP. Every meter downward in Subnautica is one I took reluctantly. Every second spent down there felt like 1 second too long. There's so much awe to be had in these spaces, but I would never ever let myself stop and just take it all in because the terror I was experiencing created a sort of franticness that is typically reserved for like chase scenes in survival horror games. What helped me push through this fear was the mystery lying at the heart of Subnautica. The survival genre has typically struggled to deliver compelling storylines, and I don't think a single one of them has managed to pull off a good ending. Subnautica delivers on both of these things, though the ending is not without its problems. Subnautica's storytelling and mystery are as integral to my enjoyment of it as is the curiosity-led exploration and the early 2000s techno-inspired soundtrack. And it's funny that I feel this strongly about the story because it isn't all that great. I mean, it's good, like it's fine, don't get me wrong, but like if I was to lay it down in front of you right now and say, this is it, you'd be like, yeah, cool, pretty good story, pretty interesting, I enjoyed it, you know, good job. But it's the way the story comes to you that makes it so memorable. The tiny spurts of information from the radio, the data pads left behind by the Degassi crew, the way you could track their movements from the island to the sea and ever deeper, the alien quarantine on the planet and why that quarantine is in effect, how to lift that quarantine and how much has been lost over thousands of years. Had all of this been presented to me in cutscenes or exposition dumps, I'd have still enjoyed it, but I likely wouldn't have savored it as much as I did. I read those datapad log entries, I scanned those alien relics, I listened to every single audio log I could get my hands on. Given how hard I fought to reach all of these morsels, I savored them in a way that I likely wouldn't have had the game just had some like human or alien telling me what to do, explaining things to me. This story, this mystery was perhaps the clincher for me in coming to love Subnautica. There were lots of other things of course, but as someone who's always recoiled from the survival survival genre rather than embracing it, this finishing touch tipped the scales for me and spurned me on when my enthusiasm might have otherwise dropped away. And that's particularly important for the last section of the game, which in my opinion, kinda blows. I'm going to say that Subnautica is a game with 3 parts. The first third is your early game, where you're learning the basics and figuring out how the world works. This occurs almost exclusively in the shallows around where your life pod crashes. The second third of the game begins when you get your sea moth. This baby can take you out way further since it's a lot faster, so you're going to be pushing into the deeper and more compelling biomes. The third part of the game begins when you've built your Cyclops and you've decided that you're going to make your big push to the deepest part of the planet. We'll talk about why this sucks soon. First, I want to say how fantastic the first 2/3 of the game are, and to do that, I'm going to use this. This is how Subnautica is for the first 2/3 of the game. Everything is getting better all the time. Your equipment, the speed at which you move, your knowledge of the world and its systems, the biomes you're exploring, the story reveals, the freedom you have to go anywhere and do anything. All of this is just constantly getting better. In the third act, all of this is ground to a screeching halt, and the graph starts to look something like this. There's only one path downward, and the Cyclops and prawn suit you become reliant upon are so annoying to drive. The material requirements for progression are so specific that it would be extremely easy to miss them if you weren't paying very, very close attention or using a guide. P.S. I used a guide. Unless you have meticulously planned your descent, you'll invariably have to head back up to collect basic materials that you really should be past collecting at this point. It's really easy to miss important landmarks down there as well, and doing so can see you die, meaning you have to put in a hell of a lot of effort to get back down there. The story reveals at this point are actually pretty great, but the scavenger hunt that you're sent on afterwards feels very tacked on. And the final grind to build the means of your escape feels like you're taking massive steps backwards rather than forward. From what I can tell, this portion of the game really had like 2 objectives. Number 1, really push the player. Engage every single game system and have it push back as hard as possible. Players really have to earn success in this final push. And number 2, do one last loop of the world as you collect the final materials you'll need for your survival. For what it's worth, I really like these objectives. I just think they got the calibration wrong. I would have enjoyed this last section much more if I could take my sea moth down there and actually explore this incredible new space. I can't even properly see outside my Cyclops, and the damn thing handles so badly it feels like someone put a 2-stroke motor on the back of a couch. With how limited my resources are down there and how slow the Cyclops is getting around, the exhilarating feeling of exploration that defined the first 2/3 of the game is all but lost here. As for the final grind, it's just boring. It really takes the wind out of the sails of an otherwise climactic finish, solving the mystery of the planet and its alien inhabitants, figuring out a way home. These are all exciting things, but they feel so constantly interrupted that you aren't riding the euphoria of the conclusion, you're trudging around in the shallows looking for copper ore. No, thank you. What's going to happen after this video is that at least a few of you are going to go out there and buy Subnautica, and then some of those people will simply hate this game for the same reasons people hate Outer Wilds, because it can seem really obtuse at times. It seems like the game is either actively trying to obfuscate things from the player, or the devs were too lazy to implement basic quality of life features like a map or menus that tell you which materials come from which things in the ocean. These people are objectively correct in their assessment that Subnautica is a badly designed game. In the era of the iPhone and cloud saves and streaming services, we look at any resistance as design failure. What do you mean I need to put the disc in the tray? What do you mean I have to put this thing together myself? What do you mean this book doesn't come in audio form? Ubisoft games in particular have followed this design philosophy, one where the player cannot be trusted to think for themselves or put up with any resistance to their progress. It's a pathological fear on the part of AAA game designers at this point. Subnautica is one of the games that stands in direct opposition to this philosophy. It never abandons the need for objectives, but it knows that finding those objectives is as important as solving them. It understands that power should not come from upgrades alone, but through an understanding of the world and its systems. It knows that story is a huge driver of engagement and retention, but it invites the player to experience that story rather than thrusting it on them. At its core, Subnautica eschews the idea of player centricity that has become the bedrock of modern day AAA game design. Instead, its world is the point of focus. In other games, if the world is unclear, confused, counterintuitive, or obtuse, then things like maps or markers or UI guides or MacGuffins or myriad other crutches can be employed to keep the player moving through it. In Subnautica, none of this is required because the world and the gameplay design is so complete. I don't need a marker to tell me to go down, I only need the courage to actually do it.